February 1991. The Persian Gulf. The air over Hikoyalar Island tasted of oil and salt. For the Iraqi soldiers entrenched in the sand, the waiting was worse than the fighting. They were dug into one of the most heavily fortified positions on Earth, a literal wall of steel and concrete, constructed according to the rigorous standards of Soviet military doctrine. They had mined the beaches. They had pre-sighted their artillery. They had filled the bunkers with hardened veterans of the Iran-Iraq War. They were waiting for the United States Marines. They expected the roar of hovercraft, the scream of jet engines, and the thunder of an amphibious assault. They were ready for a fight they understood. But on this grey, hazy morning, the threat did not come with a roar, it came with a whine. High above the trenches, a sound drifted down through the smoke of burning oil wells. It was a high-pitched, irritating buzz, like a lawnmower suspended in the sky. It was too small to be a fighter jet. It was too steady to be a helicopter. The Iraqi spotters raised their binoculars, squinting against the glare of the desert Sunday. They scanned the horizon, looking for the silhouette of an Apache or a Cobra, the machines of death they had been briefed on by their advisors. They saw nothing, just the grey sky. Then they saw the speck. It was a tiny, fragile-looking object circling lazily overhead. It looked like a toy. It had fixed landing gear and a rear-mounted propeller. It moved slowly, almost lethargically, looping in the sky with an indifference that was deeply unsettling. To the soldiers on the ground, men accustomed to the brutal speed of MiG-25 interceptors and the heavy armor of T-72 tanks, this object was a joke. It looked like something a child would assemble in a garage. It seemed to have no weapons. It had no missiles under its wings. It was just watching them. The commander of the artillery battery on the northern tip of the island hesitated. Soviet doctrine, the Bible of the Iraqi military, relied on identifying the main axis of attack and crushing it with massed fire. But what was this? Was it a scout? A distraction? A glitch in the American war machine? He barely had time to form the question. Miles away, out in the deep blue waters of the Gulf, the horizon erupted. The sound of the impact arrived before the sound of the gun. The earth didn't just shake, it liquefied. A massive explosion tore through the forward observation post, vaporizing concrete and steel in a fraction of a second. The shockwave knocked men flat in their trenches 300 yards away. Dust and debris blotted out the Sunday. Silence returned to the island, ringing in the ears of the survivors. Then, the buzzing sound returned. The tiny speck was still there. It hadn't moved. It was still circling. The soldiers scrambled. They had not seen a muzzle flash. They had not heard the scream of an incoming missile. They had been hit by something massive, something with the destructive power of a heavy bomber, but the sky was empty except for that ridiculous buzzing insect. Panic began to set in. This was impossible. Heavy artillery required spotters. It required triangulation. It required math and radio chatter and adjustments. You fired a spotting round. You watched where it landed, you adjusted, and you fired for effect. This explosion had come out of nowhere, with godlike precision, on the very first shot. Another whistle split the air. This time, the shell landed directly on the bunker complex housing the command radio. The structure simply ceased to exist. It was erased from the map. The tiny drone kept circling. For the Soviet military attachés monitoring the situation from deep within Baghdad, and for the naval analysts in Moscow poring over satellite data and intercepted radio traffic hours later, this report was not just confusing, it was terrifying. They were listening to the death throes of a well-defended island garrison, but the narrative made no sense. The reports spoke of a ghost in the sky. They spoke of battleships, ancient World War II-era relics like the USS Wisconsin, firing with the precision of a sniper rifle. This defied the laws of naval warfare as the Soviets understood them. A battleship's guns were weapons of area saturation. They were hammers, not scalpels. To hit a specific bunker on a specific island from 20 miles away required a forward observer on the ground, risking his life to call in coordinates. But there were no Americans on the island. The beaches were empty. So, what was guiding the shells? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of military technology, please take a moment to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We explore the untold stories of the conflicts that shaped our world. The stakes for the Soviet observers were existential. Their entire naval strategy was built on the assumption that American capital ships were vulnerable, blind giants. The Soviet Navy had spent billions of rubles developing fast attack boats and long-range missiles designed to overwhelm American fleets before they could get close enough to use their guns. They believed that in the fog of war, the Americans would be blind. But if the Americans had found a way to see without being seen, if they had found a way to project power onto the shore without risking a single pilot or a single Marine, reports began to trickle in from the survivors on Hikoyalar Island. They weren't shooting at the sky anymore. They were hiding. The buzzing sound had become the voice of the Grim Reaper. Every time the drone dipped a wing, something died. The soldiers on the ground realized with dawning horror that they were part of a new kind of war. They were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting a system where a plastic robot could communicate directly with a 50,000-ton warship, bypassing the entire chain of command, bypassing the need for human calculation, bypassing the possibility of error. The Soviet admirals, watching the disintegration of their client state's defenses, felt a cold chill. They were watching the Wisconsin, a ship launched in the 1940s, perform a magic trick in the 1990s. It was as if a dinosaur had suddenly learned to use a laser guidance system. The confusion on the ground turned to hysteria. The Iraqis fired their AK-47 rifles at the speck in the sky. They fired RPGs. It was too high, too small. It just buzzed on, indifferent to their panic. And then the radio chatter changed. It wasn't just coordinates anymore. The Americans were watching them run. The drone wasn't just spotting targets. It was hunting individuals. A report reached the desk of a senior analyst in the Kremlin. It described a scene that would haunt military strategists for decades. An Iraqi unit, hardened veterans, men who had faced poison gas and human wave attacks in the war against Iran, were waving white flags. But they weren't waving them at American Marines. They weren't waving them at a tank. They were waving their white shirts at the empty sky. They were surrendering to the robot. This was the impossible event. The moment the script of warfare flipped, men, biological beings with souls and fears, were submitting to a machine. And the Soviet leadership, watching from the ruins of their own collapsing empire, had to ask the question, what is that thing? And how did the Americans teach a battleship to see? The reports from Hikoyalar Island did not stay on the island. They traveled via encrypted teletype and panicked voice radio transmissions, bouncing from Iraqi command bunkers to the Soviet embassy in Baghdad, and finally to the austere, fluorescent-lit rooms of the main intelligence directorate in Moscow, the GRU. For the Soviet naval analysts sitting in those rooms, the Gulf War was already a nightmare. They were watching their best technology, the T-72 tanks, the MiG-29 fighters, the expansive radar networks being systematically dismantled by American air power. But the air war, as devastating as it was, made a terrifying kind of sense to them. The Americans had better chips, better stealth, better satellites. It was a gap in technology, but it was a gap they could measure. What was happening with the USS Wisconsin, however, was a gap in reality. The analysts spread the charts of the Persian Gulf across long wooden tables. They smoked nervously, studying the plotted impact zones. They knew the Iowa-class battleships intimately. They had studied them for 50 years. These ships were dinosaurs, relics of a bygone era of naval warfare. A 16-inch gun was a weapon of brute force. It fired a projectile that weighed as much as a small car. When it left the barrel, it was essentially a dumb object, a massive chunk of steel and high explosives, governed only by physics and wind. According to every Soviet manual on naval ballistics, the circle of error probable, the radius within which 50% of shells were expected to land for a battleship firing at a range of 20 miles, was roughly 200 to 300 yards. You didn't use a battleship to snipe a specific bunker. You used a battleship to delete a grid square. But the data coming from Hikoyalar Island told a different story. The Wisconsin was not deleting grid squares. It was knocking on doors. The first theory proposed by the Soviet advisory team was the special forces theory. It was the only explanation that fit the known variables. The Americans must have inserted a Navy SEAL team onto the island under the cover of darkness. These men would be hiding in the dunes, carrying heavy laser designators, painting the targets for the ship. It was a romantic, cinematic notion, brave men behind enemy lines, guiding the fire. It comforted the Soviet generals because it meant the Americans were taking risks. It meant that if the Iraqi garrison could just find these spies, they could stop the rain of steel. But the Iraqi commanders on the ground crushed this theory within hours. "There are no footprints," one Iraqi colonel reported, his voice cracking with strain over the radio link. "We have mined the beaches. We have thermal sights. We have swept the dunes. There is no one here. There is only the noise." The noise. The buzzing. This detail kept appearing in the after-action reports, but the analysts in Moscow initially dismissed it as irrelevant. In the chaos of a bombardment, soldiers hear things. Tinnitus, shell shock, the whine of incoming ordnance. The battlefield is a cacophony. They filtered out the references to the angry insect as psychological noise, the hallucinations of terrified men. Instead, they turned to a more disturbing possibility: the satellite theory. Had the Americans developed a way to link their keyhole spy satellites directly to the fire control computers of a 1940s battleship in real time? The Soviet technical experts argued fiercely over this. The physics seemed impossible. A satellite in low Earth orbit moves at 17,000 miles per hour. It passes over a target in minutes. To use it for live fire correction to watch a shell land, calculate the error, and send a correction to the ship before the satellite moved out of range would require a data link speed and a processing power that shouldn't exist. If the Americans had achieved this, the Cold War was not just over. It had been a misunderstanding of scale. It meant the American OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was instantaneous. Desperate for answers, the Soviets ordered their electronic warfare assets in the region to listen. They tuned their receivers to every known frequency, scanning the electromagnetic spectrum for the data links that had to be guiding the Wisconsin's guns. They looked for the telltale squawk of digital communication, the encrypted burst transmissions of a stealth team, or the high-frequency hum of a satellite uplink. They found almost nothing. There were no complex encrypted streams directed at the island. There was no heavy jamming. There was just a weak analog video signal on a frequency usually reserved for commercial model aircraft enthusiasts. It was so low power, so unencrypted, and so mundane that the Soviet electronic warfare officers initially classified it as civilian interference. They assumed it was stray interference from a television station or a local radio tower. They ignored it. This was the trap of the Soviet military mindset. They were looking for a complex, high-tech solution to match the high-tech devastation they were witnessing. They were looking for a dragon, so they ignored the mosquito. Meanwhile, the legend of the ghost grew among the Iraqi troops. The buzzing wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a harbinger. They realized that the buzzing sound always preceded the explosions by exactly 30 seconds. The time of flight for a 16-inch shell. The Iraqi air defense radar operators were screamed at by their superiors. "Shoot it down! Shoot down the spotter! We can't see it!" the operators screamed back. The Soviet-made radar systems, designed to track Mark II fighter jets and cruise missiles, were failing. The radars utilized a Doppler gate, a filter designed to ignore slow-moving objects like birds, clouds, or cars driving on a highway, so the screen wouldn't be cluttered with useless information. The mysterious American object was flying so slowly, barely 80 knots, that the Soviet radars were filtering it out as a bird. It was invisible not because it was high-tech, but because it was too slow to be a threat. The Soviets were baffled. They had built the most sophisticated air defense network in the Middle East for their Iraqi allies, a network designed to kill the SR-71 Blackbird and the B-52 bomber. And now, that entire network was being dismantled by something that flew slower than a Cessna. By the third day of the bombardment, the paranoia in the Soviet assessment group had shifted to a darker tone. They began to suspect a new class of weapon entirely. Was it a micro-stealth helicopter? A biological weapon? A grainy photograph finally emerged from the front lines, taken by a trembling Iraqi soldier looking up from his trench. It was blurry, showing a silhouette against the Sunday. The analysts in Moscow stared at the blown-up image. It didn't look like a weapon of war. It looked like a twin-boom pusher-propeller aircraft. It looked fragile. It looked cheap. "It looks," one analyst muttered, breaking the silence in the room, "like a toy." "A toy cannot guide a 2,000-pound shell to a ventilation shaft," the senior general snapped. "Find the real source. Find the designator." But they couldn't find anything else. The toy was the only thing there. The investigation had reached a dead end of cognitive dissonance. The Soviets could not reconcile the primitive nature of the aircraft in the photo with the godlike destruction raining down on Hikoyalar Island. They were trapped in a paradox. If the Americans were using a cheap, slow drone, why couldn't the Iraqis shoot it down? And if it was just a camera, How was it communicating with the ship with such perfect synchronization? They were missing the piece of the puzzle that connected the toy to the battleship. They were missing the story of a secret project that had been born not in the high-tech labs of NASA, but in a desperate bid to save the battleship from obsolescence. While the Soviets hunted for a superweapon, the Americans were deploying something far more dangerous, a simple idea executed with terrifying efficiency. The mystery was about to be solved, not by a spy, but by the surrender that would change history. The Soviets were about to learn that they didn't need to fear the high-tech stealth bomber as much as they needed to fear the unblinking eye of a plastic robot. While the analysts in Moscow were chasing phantoms and inventing theories about satellite uplinks and stealth helicopters, the truth was sitting on the fantail of the USS Wisconsin, baking in the Persian Gulf Sunday. It was not a sleek black project from the skunk works of Lockheed. It did not have the sinister geometry of the F-117 Nighthawk. It looked, frankly, like a science fair project that had gotten out of hand. It was the RQ-2 Pioneer. To understand why this ungainly machine was terrorizing the Iraqi coast, you have to understand the problem the Americans were trying to solve. The Iowa-class battleships were the ultimate hammers, but they were blind. Their 16-inch guns could hurl a projectile nearly 24 miles. The problem was the curvature of the Earth. At that range, the target was well below the horizon. The ship's optical rangefinders were useless. The ship's radar could see the coastline, but it couldn't see the specific bunker, the specific tank, or the specific trench line hidden behind the dunes. For decades, the solution had been spotter planes or helicopters, but in 1991, flying a manned helicopter low and slow over enemy territory was suicide. The Iraqis had thousands of shoulder-fired missiles and radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. To send a pilot to spot for the Wisconsin was to send him to his death. So, the US Navy did something that the rigid top-down hierarchy of the Soviet military would never have permitted. They improvised. They looked at the Israeli military, which had been experimenting with small, unmanned scouts during the Lebanon War, and they bought the concept. The result was the Pioneer. It was small, only 14 feet long. It was powered by a 26-horsepower snowmobile engine. It was made of fiberglass and epoxy. It was cheap, disposable, and, by the standards of military aviation, laughably primitive. But on the deck of the Wisconsin, the Americans had turned this primitive tool into a weapon of unprecedented sophistication. The launch procedure itself was a violent spectacle. Because the drone had no wheels and the battleship had no runway, the Pioneer was mounted on a rail launcher. A rocket booster, strapped to the drone's belly, would ignite with a deafening roar, blasting the tiny aircraft from 0 to 80 knots in a split second. It would scream off the back of the ship, discard the rocket into the sea, and then the buzzing two-stroke engine would take over, climbing slowly into the hazy sky. This was the source of the angry insect sound the Iraqis heard. The genius of the Pioneer was not its airframe, but its eyes. Under its nose sat a stabilized turret containing a high-resolution television camera. And crucially, this camera was hardwired to a C-band transmitter. This was the secret link that the Soviets had missed. They were looking for complex encrypted digital bursts. They were looking for computer code. But the Pioneer was broadcasting a simple, continuous analog video signal, essentially a live TV show. On board the Wisconsin, deep inside the armored citadel of the ship, the gunnery officer wasn't listening to a radio description of the target. He was watching it. A row of monitors showed him exactly what the drone saw in real time. He could see the Iraqi soldiers smoking cigarettes in their trenches. He could see the heat shimmering off their tank engines. He could see the panicked faces of the officers. The feedback loop was instantaneous. The drone operator, sitting in a container on the deck, would steer the crosshairs over a target. "Target acquired," he would say. The gunnery officer would lay the massive 16-inch guns onto the bearing. Boom! The ship would shudder as the guns fired. 30 seconds later, on the TV screen, the bunker would disappear in a cloud of dust. If the shell missed by 50 yards, the drone operator would simply say, "Adjust left 50, drop 200. The correction was made in seconds. This was the impossible accuracy the Soviets were witnessing. It wasn't magic. It was a closed-circuit TV system attached to the biggest guns in the world. But what about the invisibility? Why couldn't the sophisticated Soviet-made radars see it? The answer lay in the accidental genius of the design. The Pioneer was made of fiberglass, which is transparent to radar waves. Its engine was tiny, its radar cross-section was smaller than a seagull. But the real cloak of invisibility was its speed. The Soviet air defense network was built to fight World War III. It was designed to track supersonic bombers and cruise missiles. The Doppler radars used by the Iraqi Karyuki and Roland systems had velocity gates, filters designed to ignore slow-moving clutter like birds, clouds, and car traffic. If the radar displayed every bird in the sky, the operator would be blinded by noise. So, the system was programmed to ignore anything moving slower than 100 knots. The Pioneer cruised at 70 knots. To the billion-dollar Soviet radar network, the Pioneer literally did not exist. It was filtered out as a bird. The Americans had flown right through the blind spot of the Soviet technological philosophy. The Soviets believed in faster, higher, stronger. The Americans realized that sometimes the most dangerous thing on the battlefield is the thing that is too slow to be a threat. And so, the Ghost circled Failaka Island with impunity. It could stay airborne for 5 hours. It never blinked. It never got tired. It never felt fear. It just watched and buzzed and guided the shells. The crew of the Wisconsin even developed a unique way to recover the drone. Since they couldn't land it on the deck, they flew it into a giant net strung up on the back of the ship, like catching a butterfly. It was crude, it was risky, and it looked ridiculous. But it worked. By the time the events of Part 4 unfolded, the Pioneer had already proven that a cheap robot could defeat an expensive air defense network. But the true psychological impact, the moment that would horrify the Soviet admirals, was yet to come. The drone was about to do something that no machine had ever done in the history of warfare. It was about to take prisoners. The stage was set for the final humiliation of the Soviet doctrine. The toy was about to become the master. February 27th, 1991. The climax of the mystery arrived not with a bang, but with a grainy black and white image flickering on a monitor deep within the Combat Information Center of the USS Wisconsin. The ship was preparing to delete another grid square on Failaka Island. The massive turrets were rotating. The powder bags were being rammed into the breaches. High above the island, the RQ-2 Pioneer, the toy that the Soviets had dismissed, was buzzing low over a fortified trench line. The drone operator, a young petty officer sitting in a converted shipping container on the deck of the battleship, pushed his joystick forward. He needed a better look. He needed to verify that the trench was still active before he called down the thunder. The drone dipped its nose. The buzzing sound grew louder for the men on the ground. In Moscow, the expectation for this kind of engagement was brutal and simple. The Iraqi soldiers, trained in Soviet doctrine, should have opened fire with everything they had. They should have filled the sky with lead to bring down the spotter. That was what the manuals said. That was what the rigorous training at the academies in the USSR had dictated. But the manual did not account for the psychological terror of the Ghost. On the monitor aboard the Wisconsin, the drone operator saw movement. He tensed, his thumb hovering over the target button that would send the coordinates to the fire control computer. He expected to see muzzle flashes. He expected to see the white smoke of a shoulder-fired missile. Instead, he saw hands. Dozens of them. The Iraqi soldiers were climbing out of their hardened bunkers. They were not holding rifles. They were stripping off their white undershirts. They were holding up rags, pieces of paper, anything white they could find. They were looking up at the sky, eyes wide with terror, waving frantically at the buzzing plastic insect circling their heads. The drone operator froze. He keyed his headset. "Sir, you're not going to believe this." "Target acquired?" the gunnery officer asked. "No, sir," the operator stammered. They're surrendering." "Surrendering to who?" "To me, sir. They are surrendering to the drone." This was the moment that sent a shockwave through the military attachés and intelligence officers watching the war unfold. It was the first time in the history of human conflict that a combat unit had formally surrendered to a robot. When the reports and the footage eventually reached the Soviet High Command, the reaction was not just confusion, it was horror. It was a visceral, stomach-churning realization that the nature of war had fundamentally changed, and they were on the wrong side of history. The Soviet admirals were horrified because this surrender represented the total collapse of the warrior ethos they relied on. They had built an ideology based on courage, sacrifice, and the great patriotic war. They believed that men fought men. Machines were just tools. But here, on a dusty island in the Gulf, the human element had been removed from the American side. The Americans weren't even risking a pilot. They were projecting power through a remote-controlled avatar. The Iraqi soldiers realized that they couldn't kill the enemy because the enemy wasn't there. They were fighting a ghost. And you cannot fight a ghost. You can only beg it for mercy. The shock moment for the Soviets was the realization of total asymmetry. They had spent 40 years building the MiG-25 Foxbat, a machined steel beast capable of flying at Mach 3 to hunt American bombers. They had built the Kirov-class battlecruisers, bristling with missiles, to hunt American carriers. But the Wisconsin hadn't used a bomber, it hadn't used a carrier, it had used a model airplane. The Soviet countermeasures were instantly rendered obsolete. You cannot fire $1 million SA-6 missile at a drone that costs a few $1,000s and emits almost no heat. The missile seeker head won't lock on, the radar won't see it. The MiG-25 pilots couldn't engage it, they flew too fast. If they tried to intercept the Pioneer, they would stall and crash before they could get a bead on it. The Soviets watched in despair as their entire technological philosophy, bigger, faster, stronger, crumbled before a philosophy of smarter, smaller, cheaper. The surrender on Hikoyalar Island was the final proof that the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War not just economically, but conceptually. They had prepared for a boxing match, and the Americans had brought a sniper rifle. The impossible event from Part 1 was solved. It wasn't a stealth bomber, it wasn't a satellite. It was the psychological weight of a 1940s battleship delivered through the lens of a 1990s robot. The buzzing sound was no longer a mystery, it was the sound of the future, arriving to tell the Soviet Union that it was obsolete. The smoke eventually cleared over Hikoyalar Island. The USS Wisconsin ceased its fire, its massive barrels cooling in the salt air. The Iraqi garrison, shattered and demoralized, was processed into captivity. But the true casualty of that engagement was not the bunkers made of concrete and rebar. The true casualty was the Soviet understanding of warfare. When the dust settled, the military analysts in the Pentagon and the grim-faced generals in Moscow sat down to review the numbers. The statistics were not just impressive, they were revolutionary. During the course of the conflict, the battleships Wisconsin and Missouri fired over 1,100 rounds of 16-inch ordnance. In previous wars, World War II, Korea, Vietnam naval gunfire support was a game of volume. You fired hundreds of shells to suppress an area. You accepted that 90% of them would just churn up the dirt. But with the RQ-2 Pioneer watching from above, the efficiency rate skyrocketed. The circle of error collapsed. The battleships were no longer area denial weapons, they were precision instruments. They were hitting point targets, specific buildings, specific artillery pieces, specific trench lines with the first or second salvo. The killer statistic that haunted the Soviet general staff was the cost-exchange ratio. The Soviet Union had spent billions of rubles helping Iraq build a layered air defense network. They had sold them Roland missiles, SA-6 batteries, and complex radar tracking stations. A single SA-6 missile battery cost millions of dollars. The RQ-2 Pioneer drone cost roughly $50,000, the price of a luxury sedan in 1991. The Americans had used a $50,000 model airplane to completely neutralize a multi-billion-dollar defensive network. The drone simply flew too low for the heavy radars and too slow for the fast jets. It was a technological judo throw, using the enemy's weight and sophistication against them. The Soviets realized with sinking hearts that their entire economic model of warfare was broken. They could not afford to shoot down cheap drones with expensive missiles. They would go bankrupt trying. This realization fed into the larger, systemic collapse of the Soviet Union. For decades, the Cold War had been a contest of hardware. Who had the biggest tank? Who had the fastest jet? Who had the most megatons? The Soviets were masters of hardware. They could pour steel better than anyone. They could build titanium submarines and massive ICBMs. But the incident with the USS Wisconsin proved that the hardware age was over. The software age had begun. The American advantage wasn't the 16-inch gun. The Soviets had big guns too. The advantage was the information link. It was the ability to see, decide, and act faster than the enemy. The Americans had successfully integrated a 1940s ship with 1990s robotics. This required a flexibility of thought, a culture of innovation, and a decentralized command structure that the Soviet system simply did not possess. In the Soviet military, a captain would never have been allowed to strap a snowmobile engine to a camera and fly it off a battleship without 10 years of committee meetings and authorization from the Politburo. In the US Navy, they just did it because it worked. This was the revolution in military affairs that Marshal Ogarkov, the prophetic Soviet chief of general staff, had feared in the early 1980s. He had warned the Kremlin that American microelectronics and precision guidance would make traditional mass armies obsolete. The Kremlin had ignored him, preferring to build more tanks. On Hikoyalar Island, Ogarkov's nightmare became reality. The tank was dead. The bunker was a coffin. The robot was king. The legacy of that moment is written in the sky above every modern battlefield. Today, we take drones for granted. We see the MQ-9 Reaper patrolling the skies. We see quadcopters buzzing over conflict zones in Eastern Europe. We see swarms of loitering munitions. But it all started there, in the Persian Gulf, with that primitive, buzzing insect. The surrender of the Iraqi soldiers to the Pioneer was the crossing of a threshold. It was the moment humanity handed the keys of the battlefield to the machine. It was the moment the fog of war began to lift, replaced by the unblinking, high-resolution gaze of the electric eye. The USS Wisconsin now sits as a museum ship in Norfolk, Virginia. Its massive guns are silent, welded shut, a monument to the era of industrial warfare. But the RQ-2 Pioneer that flew off its deck is not just a relic, it is a patriarch. It hangs in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a testament to the moment the script flipped. For the Soviet admirals who watched the footage in 1991, the horror wasn't just about losing an ally in the Middle East. It was the realization that they had spent 50 years preparing for a war of strength, only to be defeated by a war of intelligence. They were the grandmasters of chess, sitting at the board, only to realize the Americans were playing a video game. The buzzing sound that terrified the soldiers on Hikoyalar Island never really went away. It just got louder, faster, and deadlier. The ghost of the Gulf is still flying today, and it sees everything.